A full moon is shown in the sky above the castle. A man was visible in the window, lying his head on the table. The man asked what to do. The people would soon begin to starve, and the Duke didn't care. He was doing nothing to prevent it. Something burning flew past the window. The man looked out the window with alarm. He peered out. The people below were fighting. His mouth opened in shock. The man exclaimed, "Is that really the Imperial Army?" He pictured a man wearing a crown. With a shocked expression on his face, he said it was Emperor Zaren. Burning cannonballs were flying toward the castle. The man saw a man on the roof. Leaning out the window, he called out to the Duke. A warrior with a sword stood on the roof. Hearing the request to flee from there, one of the projectiles hit the roof directly. The second flew toward the window with the terrified man. Flames erupted around them. With his mouth wide open, the burning man called out to the Duke. That's how the land of Bran fell. A useless patch of land on the edge of the Empire. The boy jumped up in bed. He clutched his chest, breathing heavily. He, the local Duke's butler, had perished with him. The boy looked in surprise at the mirror, thinking more accurately that he should have died. Touching his face, the man in the boy's body said he couldn't believe he had become a Duke. He had been reborn 20 years before their deaths. The boy sat clutching his head. A whole day had passed since he had been reborn into the body of Duke Aaron. In a broken state and utter confusion, he hadn't eaten or drunk and hadn't spoken to anyone. Flexing his fingers, Aaron screamed like a man. He spent the second day furiously cursing the Emperor who had killed him and all the inhabitants of Bran, falling asleep and waking up delirious, pondering how to take revenge. Aaron touched the mirror with his palm. On the third day, he finally calmed down and realized he had a second chance to make things right. His fingers touched a document on the table, and he had to bury himself in a book to learn everything about the Duke. Early in his life, he had decided to prevent the impending horror, and after a couple of days, endless hunger forced him to stop. His fingers clutched a loaf of bread. Holding it in his hand, Aaron reflected that while he had spent his entire life helping the poor, who couldn't even afford a piece of bread, the Duke had never cared for anyone but himself, as if they weren't his subjects. Cheryl, Aaron's younger sister and a former imperial princess, pointed and exclaimed, "Why is he doing this?" She had spent so much time dragging him out of the room so he wouldn't starve there, and he hadn't. Looking at her fearfully, the boy apologized, saying it would be easier to chew the bread this way. With a slight tilt of his head, Aaron asked if she was free today and suggested they go somewhere. His sister frowned, asking where. The guys were standing in the dungeon. Rommel, the knight captain and unofficial swordsman, scratched his neck and said he'd ordered him to handle their food supplies, so why had he called them here in full armor? Aaron's mouth dropped open and he said Emperor Zaren was planning to destroy them. The guys looked at him in surprise. Cheryl's eyes widened and she said that their uncle, the Emperor, had sworn an oath to their father. Why would they break it? Aaron, wearing armor, explained that he was probably afraid they would use their right to the throne. And besides, he'd been personally informed of his plans to break his promise. Looking forward, the boy declared it was time to use the dragon's blessing. Glancing sideways at the man, his sister remarked that he'd wanted to keep him hidden until the very end. Aaron crossed his arms and replied that he hadn't been concerned about the Emperor's betrayal until recently. The girl pointed her flower-shaped staff forward and thought it was very strange. Her brother never talked nonsense. A portal to the mountains opened before them. Rommel exclaimed in shock. Turning around, Cheryl asked slightly. He didn't know for sure. She hadn't told him. She was an unofficial mage. The guys stood at a cliff in the frozen lands. Stretch her arms. The girl asked not to judge harshly. She hadn't practiced for a long time. Cheryl raised her staff. A fireball flew forward. The mage moved the staff in a circle. The fire moved. Eventually, several fireballs were arranged in a circle before her. Rommel, her mouth open in shock, said that it was in fact a ring of inferno. With a wave of her hand, the girl sent the fireball forward. The fire obscured the mountain top. It was destroyed. The knight's mouth fell open in utter shock. Cheryl, with a fire in her palm, said indifferently that it was weak, just above the seventh circle. She was an unofficial seventh circle mage. Looking at her in surprise, the knight asked, "So she's a seventh circle mage?" The girl replied, "Yes, but that wasn't enough to defeat the entire Imperial army." Touching his chin, Aaron confirmed that it wasn't enough. They still had a long time to gain strength, and he thought to himself that the Duke's diary stated that she was a fifth circle mage, but in reality, she was an archmage. The girl waved her staff, saying that compared to her brother, all these things were mere toys. The knight turned to him in shock and asked, "Is that true?" The Duke drew his sword and said he'd find out now, and thought he'd try. He pulled out a page from the diary yesterday and thought about judging it. Touching his face thoughtfully, he explained that thanks to the dragon's blessing, his sister had become a fifth circle mage, and the Duke himself a grandmaster warrior. Clenching and unclenching his fingers, Aaron said that he too possessed that power. He walked over to the bookcase and took one of the books from it. Looking at the brown cover, Fundamentals of Imperial Swordsmanship, he thought, "That's it." He couldn't become the best swordsman in the world right away. He'd start from the basics. Aaron raised his sword and stepped forward. Lightning appeared around the blade. Furrowing his brows, the boy shouted that this was the third version of the great sword art. Channeling energy forward, he unleashed piercing wind. A blue beam flew forward. It split the mountain in half. Dust rose from the destruction. Aaron put his sword away with a smile and thought he'd been aiming for the wrong mountain. But this would do. Rommel, very shocked. His mouth dropped open. A dragon flew in the sky. It turned its attention to the city below. It sniffed the air and thought unbelievably that here remained a trace of the blessing it had left generations ago. The dragon spun in the air and plummeted in flight. It transformed into a bird. A human foot touched the ground. A man held a fan, saying it was an excellent vessel. He stood in the forest not far from the castle. Fanning himself, he said it was time to meet the people he had blessed. The brother and sister looked ahead resolutely. A boy stood by a bookshelf holding Duke Diary. A few days before he decided to become a duke, he opened the handwritten book. The man towered over the king lying in bed. Several years ago, with the help of a feudal lord, his father's brother, Uncle Zarin, had taken the throne from his weakened old father. He imagined a man in a crown and departing travelers, thinking that his father had died soon after, so he and Cheryl had fled the persecution of the authorities. The reason they had survived was because of the single condition his father had set for his brother to protect them. Imagining the coat of arms, he remembered that the children would never lay claim to the throne for the rest of their lives. And for that reason, he must allow Aaron to become Duke of the land of Bran on the edge of the empire. The monsters rushed forward. Bran was a useless land with a decrepit fortress. Naturally, nothing grew on it, and it was constantly attacked by monsters. Babies lay in cradles. Thanks to the dragon's blessing, he and Cheryl wielded the powers of a grandmaster. The guys stood on the wall. They had the power to restore life in this land. However, the Duke looked ahead, thinking that he had decided to hide his abilities for the rest of his life. Aaron held the diary, thinking it was to keep the promise he made to his father. He slammed the book shut and wondered if any promise was more valuable than the lives of his subjects. Currently, in the fortress of Bran, the boy winced in pain. The swelling on his wrist was surrounded by light. He moved his hand. Then, surprised, he exclaimed that it didn't hurt. A fair-haired girl pointed and asked him to play carefully, lest his parents worry. It was Cecilia, the saint of the Vivian Order. Folding his hands in front of him, the boy agreed. Patting his head, the saint praised him. She turned, hearing the order for everyone to appear in the square. The Duke would give a speech. Aaron stood on a stone in front of the crowd. A man crossed his arms and asked what he wanted from them. Another asked, "Who knows? He might say some more nonsense, maybe even introduce taxes." A mustachioed man in a hood asked if they had heard how the Duke had changed recently. Some of the people were beaten. Aaron said he'd heard about it. He'd found all the knights who had taken money from the people and punished them. Aaron crossed his arms, thinking he wasn't surprised by the crowd's reaction. They knew nothing yet because the Duke hadn't fulfilled his duties at all. He waved his hand. Standing on the D's, the boy declared that intelligence had reported that the orcs' numbers had increased sharply, and they were trying to take their lands. If they surrounded the castle, the people would no longer be able to obtain food. They couldn't sit idly by and wait for death. A man standing in the crowd said the orcs had been doing this for years. Another asked if he just heard about it, and a third said he thought it was something serious. Touching his chest, Aaron exclaimed, "Are they really going to remain victims of these green skins? Or are they going to come with him to fight for their lives?" The crowd stared at him in surprise, wondering where he'd gotten this from. The boy shouted that he was Duke Aaron, their lord and master of the Bran lands, issuing a new decree. A cry echoed through the small settlement, declaring that they would no longer sit in a stubborn defense against the orcs. They were now invaders. The men exchanged surprised glances. Imagining the monster by the sacks, Aaron exclaimed, "How much longer will they endure the orcs' oppression? How much longer will they watch them live richer than them?" The crowd was outraged. Aaron smirked. Raising his fist, he affirmed, saying they were going to overthrow the orcs, and everyone would become rich. The people's fists rose to greedy chances. A man in a white cloak stood among the others. Looking at the young man in the crowd, he wondered if he had received his blessing. A smile appeared on the dragon's lips, and he said he didn't want to stay long, but he had potential. A scroll appeared in his hand. Words could be heard from the room with the books, saying he had ordered everything to be bought yesterday. Aaron and the bearded old man were arguing angrily. Their conversation could be heard. Why hadn't he even bought 100 suits of armor? The young man replied, "What if the expedition fails?" He then heard the old man say, "What if he takes responsibility then?" The guys glared at each other. There was a knock on the black door. The disputants turned angrily, shouting at each other to enter and leave. As the door opened, Rommel appeared and announced that a man from Duke Rhaenon's recommendation had come to see him. The guys stared at him in surprise. The man, scroll in hand, bowed in greeting and said his name was Kynus and that he had come on Duke Rhaenon's recommendation. Taking the scroll, Aaron asked again on his personal recommendation and mentally recalled Kynus, thinking he had introduced himself as a strategist, but had left them a year later. His appearance was hard to forget. The boy unfolded the paper. He carefully read that 3 years had passed since he settled in the lands of Bran. On the parchment were black lines stating that there wasn't a day when he wasn't painfully reminded of his constant struggle to survive in this hell. This time he sent him a promising strategist and some gold for the treasury. He hoped Kynus would serve him well these 3 years and that they would meet again someday. Holding the scroll, Aaron mused that Duke Rhaenon had been loyal to the late emperor. Then his eyes widened with realization. Returning to the man, he asked for a little gold. The old man's eyes lit up with greed. Kindness laughed, saying he had sent 50,000 gold. The old advisor was saddened, saying it was understandable. The Duke was also going through hard times. Looking at him, Aaron ordered him not to complain. The money could buy enough equipment, and use the rest to cleanse the city. The man, surprised, asked again, "Cleanse the city?" Raising a finger, Aaron argued that investing for the future meant keeping gold in the treasury was imperceptible. It was better to invest it. If they didn't clean up the cities, frequent outbreaks of disease would occur, and then they would lose their most important resource, people. The fewer people they had, the more difficult it would be to distribute their forces, ultimately leading to the collapse of the castle. The dragon covered his face with a fan, thinking that his logic wasn't entirely sound. But more importantly, his train of thought was on the right track. Few people thought so far ahead, even fewer remembered hygiene. Perhaps he would be suitable as the caretaker of his nest. As he left the room, the old man grumpily told them to do whatever they wanted, and he resigned. The doors slammed. Aaron looked at Kindness and thought this was a strategist from Duke Rhinon on himself. He was just about to memorize strategy textbooks when he appeared just in time. Touching his chin, Aaron said that although the Duke had recommended him, he should understand that he couldn't immediately appoint him as chief strategist, as that could cause many of his subjects to rebel. The man nodded, confirming his point. Looking at him, Aaron continued that he would therefore be glad if he could demonstrate his skills in the upcoming campaign against the orcs. Shielding his face with a fan, Kindness said he would assist him in the upcoming campaign and thought how a pathetic man could doubt him. That was interesting. Aaron smiled, saying he relied on him and thought that if all went well, he would work with this man for the next 3 years. Kindness fanned himself, thinking that the better he got to know this man, the more fascinating he would become. And he promised out loud that he wouldn't let him down. Bowing his head, the boy remembered that his goal after the war with the orcs was to develop the dungeons. The guy was surprised. Aaron stood before a group of warriors a week later. Putting his hand on his hip, he said he hoped everyone had memorized their strategy by now. Did anyone need to explain it all over again? The soldiers remained silent. Looking at them, the boy resolutely exclaimed that they were leaving then. Pointing his sword forward, he shouted that today they would destroy the orc lair and become rich. Spears rose. The gates opened. Aaron rode ahead of the others on horseback. The guys stood at a cliff in the Black Forest. Aaron looked down, thinking that Kurok was the chieftain of an orc tribe who had captured a citadel and made a nest there. He imagined monsters attacking people and thought that because of them, their food supply lines had been destroyed. And a few years later, it was precisely because of them that a mass famine began. The boy clenched his fist, thinking that the problem needed to be nipped in the bud, and that's what he would do. Ramos, standing behind him, hit himself in the chest and said that they had found the cobalt archers. Without turning around, the boy asked how many. Looking at him, the knight replied, 5 groups, each with 5 or 6 monsters. Aaron turned and called Cheryl. His sister peeked out of the tent. Aaron drew a circle in the air with his finger. With a disgruntled sigh, the girl said she was already on her way. The girl, holding a staff, walked through the forest. A fireball soared upward. A face was visible on the fireball of the 3rd circle. Rays of light emanated from the staff. Cheryl said that this was the 3rd circle spell, which hits like the 5th. Flames flew forward. The monster with the club stood in front of the others. The kobolds looked up. A fireball surrounded them. The monsters, engulfed in flames, screamed. The guys watched the smoke rise. Touching his head sadly, Aaron asked what the 3rd circle was that hit like the 5th. He had asked them not to use magic stronger than the 3rd circle so as not to attract the Emperor's attention. The offended sister stuck her tongue out at him. Aaron covered his face with his hand, thinking that if he'd known she'd use anything other than the piercing wind, he wouldn't have taken her today. Ines waved his fan and said he'd find out sooner or later, especially since the soldiers didn't spread rumors. There shouldn't be any problems. Closing his eyes, the Duke agreed and asked, "Have they found the right place?" The man confirmed with a confident expression. The day before the campaign began, Kindness fanned himself and said the best outcome of the war against the monsters was to destroy them before the real war began. They had little choice, and now the best strategy was to draw the enemy to a convenient location and destroy them there. The young man sitting at the table asked again, and was told this was necessary to avoid heavy losses. He introduced armored warriors, saying that the orc tribe numbered about 2,000, and even if they won, the losses would be incomparable. They only had 500 warriors. The sister and the knight nodded. Looking at them, Kindness continued that besides everything else, since they were attacking, every move needed to be carefully considered. He pictured the orcs catching up to the knight, and advised luring them out first with cavalry. He turned with a smile to Aaron, who asked, "Should they use 100 cavalrymen as bait?" Pictured goblins stricken with arrows. The dragon explained that this would give them speed. They would set an ambush as soon as the orcs approached the forest. Archers and marksmen should destroy at least half the enemy force. He pictured knights with shields surrounding the monsters and continued. Then they would push them into open ground and surround them with heavily armed knights until they surrendered. Closing one eye, the boy said that was excellent. Then he looked ahead and said that they would proceed according to Kindness's plan. The monsters lay in the burning forest. The goblins approached the body. Then they ran off to the side. A rider standing by the cliff heard what appeared to be their movement. Behind them was Kindness, who said that these seemed to be unusual orcs. Since they had scouts, they would quickly prepare for battle as soon as they sensed trouble. Smiling, the man asked, "If that was the case, why not make the advanced orcs their slaves?" Aaron turned to him. Shielding his face with a fan, the man said he thought such a workforce would help his goal of developing the dungeons. Aaron was struck by the idea. Looking at the advisor, he said the idea was good. But would monsters really help a human? He'd heard that monsters only listened to dragons' orders. The dragon in the human's body laughed, saying no. Orcs were a species that obeyed only superior force, so being a dragon wasn't necessary. Turning away, the boy said he'd deal with it later. He didn't want his greed to lead to more casualties. The advisor nodded. Standing in front of the forest, the boy asked, "Is it time to begin?" Turning to Cheryl, he ordered 200 soldiers to take positions in the forest, while Rama was to form an iron ring and ambush. Turning the other way, he asked Kindness to remain at the top of the hill. The man with the fan nodded in agreement. Aaron extended his sword. Then he pointed them forward with a war cry. The orc leader sat on his throne, eating meat. A monster approached him and announced that the humans were attacking. The leader spat out a piece. Kurak, radiating a sinister aura, asked where it was coming from. An orc with sharp fangs replied. From the black forest, a shadow fell across the leader's face, who said that the insects hiding behind the stone walls had finally emerged, already dead. Raising his hand with a club, the monster roared that the meat was coming to them, that they would kill all the humans and capture their castle. The crowd of warriors at the castle roared in response. The leader's eyes blazed, and he ordered the release of the Minotaur. One of the orcs tugged at the chain. A huge bull with an axe was in the cage. He raised his ringed nose and roared. Kurak swung his club and called for killing and plunder. His subordinates raised their weapons in response. The sinister army of monsters advanced. The sun was visible from behind the hills. A bird flew across the sky. The orcs ran quickly. The bird watched them from above. The monsters reflected in its eye. Between the man's palms was a magic ball, standing at the edge of the cliff. Kindness mentally told the man that the time had come. The army was moving forward. Drawing his sword, Aaron ordered them to prepare for clash. He raised his weapon. Swinging it, he shouted forward. The horse galloped quickly. An orc ran towards them. The two armies were almost at each other. The knights heard the order to attack. The orcs opened their mouths and roared. Sparks of battle rose up. Aaron and 100 cavalry against Kurak and 2,000 orcs. Aaron swung his sword. Drops of blood appeared. The armies clashed. Looking at the orc, the boy thought that it wasn't enough. He needed to press them further, and then he noticed something ahead. An axe was descending. It flew at Aaron's head. The huge minotaur raised its jaws and screamed. Aaron and his soldiers covered their ears. Turning, the boy shouted to not be afraid and to keep moving. The knights exchanged glances. Aaron charged forward, shouting. A green monster stood before him. Aaron raised his sword. He remembered his advisor's words about manpower helping the dungeons develop. He swung his sword sharply downwards. The blow landed flat. Looking at the approaching monsters, he thought they had driven them into the black forest. Turning, the Duke ordered a retreat as there were too many enemies. The orcs looked at him in surprise. The human army turned, growling and shouting that the humans were running away. They must follow. Together with the Minotaur, they gave chase. The humans led the orcs out of the forest. A man galloping behind them told the Lord that they were being pursued. Turning to the red-haired woman, he shouted that he would deal with them and tell them to retreat to the hill. He galloped back, thinking he had no intention of losing them. He looked determined. The Minotaur raised its arm to attack, and Aaron continued his thought, not a single one of his own. The knight turned to face the monster's fists, and Aaron continued. A soldier. He struck the bull with his sword. The monster was thrown back, and its carcass fell to the ground. The knight, watching this, let out a delighted sound. Putting his foot on the monster's body, Aaron thought she told him to go up the hill. But at least he wouldn't have to drag it himself. He asked Arthur to tie up this monster and throw it further into the bushes. The man with the mustache looked surprised, asking, Will he kill him? Looking at him, the boy replied, No, he'll need him later. Alarmed, the man agreed. The knight pointed and said that the orcs were advancing. The monsters were approaching, and one of them said, Here are the humans, while the other suggested killing them all. Light fell on their faces. They looked up, looking at the fireballs. A powerful explosion sounded. Turning around, Aaron wondered what Cheryl was doing. Why kill all the orcs? He ordered a retreat. Kurak watched him. Frowning, he ordered them to catch up. They would avenge all their brothers. The knights galloped toward the sunset. The orc ran after them. Suddenly, something hit him in the temple. He tumbled backwards. A row of shields formed in front of the orcs. Human knights held them. The green monsters growled at this. The shields formed a wall. Aaron walked proudly past them. Looking down, he said that Kurak and all his kin were surrounded. He was giving everyone a chance to survive. A duel between the two leaders would take place, and the losing race would become slaves. Frowning, the green monster said that the orc didn't trust the human and thought that if he wanted, all his orcs would be killed. Humans couldn't be trusted. Looking down, the boy promised to swear on his warrior's honor, and he would do the same. Looking at him, the orc chieftain said that a human had no honor. Aaron frowned and ordered them to lock shields. The knights did so. Raising his club, Kurak agreed and asked him to keep his promise. The opponents stood facing each other. The monster took off abruptly. Swinging his club, he wished for death. The club struck the ground. Aaron stood unharmed in the dispersing dust. Steam billowed from the orc's mouth. Aaron dodged the club. watching his opponent. He thought this was what the dragon's blessing felt like. He hadn't yet fully mastered his body, but it seemed to react to the orc's attacks. Looking at him darkly, the monster called him a coward. Eren grew angry. The blade sank into the ground. Angrily cracking his knuckles, Eren said he would teach him manners. A frightened Rommel screamed, asking why he threw down his sword. Flexing his fists, the Duke asked him not to worry. He'd teach him a good lesson. Kurok tossed aside his club, saying that a man has honor, and then he too would throw down his weapon. He would break a man with his own hands. Rommel watched him approach the Lord, thinking that no matter how strong a man without a weapon was, anyone would lose to an orc. His paw reached for his fist. The man thought that orcs grew in battle their entire lives. They were stronger than most humans. Even their claws had become sharper, especially since the Duke wasn't even wearing gloves. The monster flew forward rapidly. Eren watched the paw approach, his gaze intent. He watched the green hand move and wondered why it moved so slowly. He was concentrating slightly. Turning, the boy wondered what kind of blow he'd strike. The orc clenched his fist and swung, attacking the boy, thinking he'd test him. Eren dodged the attack. A fist lightly grazed his cheek. The Duke slid back, touching the scratches. He thought he knew it would happen. It barely hurt. One of the warriors behind the shield asked if the Lord was really being defeated and what would happen to them if he really lost. Kurok beat his chest, shouting that he would make all the humans slaves. He stood in front of the boy and growled. Eren held up a finger and ordered him to be quiet. The orc tensed, jumping up. Eren extended his hand, saying that today was their time. He slapped the orc across the face with his palm. He fell to the ground. The monster shook his head. Jumping to his feet, Kurok asked if the human was using magic, and where was his honor. He was surprised when Eren approached, saying that they would become slaves. The boy attacked again, finishing with their slaves. The orc leader flew back. He flew towards the knights, who ordered their shields to be raised. The barriers became a wall. The orc bounced off the shields and flew toward Eren. Eren caught the orc's head in his hands, smashing it between his palms like a sword. The orc's eyes closed, and he begged for mercy. Eren slammed him hard into the ground. The battered chieftain lay in the rising dust. The handprint remained on the ground near his head. The orc's enslavement was complete. Eren held the bound orc's rope. He stood on the wall with him, coughing into his fist. He addressed the orcs, saying that he did not intend to kill them yet, but from now on, they would become slaves to humans. The monsters looked stunned. Looking down, the boy continued that they would now work on Bran's lands. In exchange, he would grant them the right to hunt in the nearby forests. If their tasks were completed, they would share their food with him. However, if even one orc tried to rebel, he would kill them all and personally break the neck of anyone standing there. The orcs also looked at him silently. A vein bulged on the boy's face. He grabbed Kurok by the hair and shouted that if they remained silent, he would do to them the same as he had done to him. The monsters lined up in a chorus, agreed that everything was understood. Eren smiled, saying that in exchange for his wasted time and punishment for their misdeeds, they would take food from their reserves for themselves. The warriors rode into the fortress. The people rejoiced, praising the Duke. The soldiers returned victorious. They had defeated the orcs. Eren waved his hand. Looking at the knight, he asked him to bring the orcs. The prisoners emerged from the portal. Eren raised his sword using great swordsmanship and piercing wind. Waves of energy scattered everywhere. The bound orc trembled, thinking of this power. Turning to the captives, Eren declared that the orcs would serve the dragon's great power. They pressed their foreheads to the ground and heard the command to raise their heads. Pointing his sword, Eren told them to remember what he had single-handedly done to this city and to remember their place in this world. The next day, Kurok knelt, declaring that his brothers swore not to reveal his power. If they tried to take revenge, he would stop them. Looking down, the red-haired one asked them to remember that if any single orc did anything, he would exterminate their entire species. Kainos approached Eren, saying that he had truly subjugated the orc. That was commendable. Spreading his arms, the boy said that they seemed to have mistaken him for a dragon. That made the task easier. The man laughed, hiding his face behind his fan, and asked again. Looking ahead, he asked. He knows dragons never forgive those who pretend to be one of them, right? The boy waved his hand and asked them not to misunderstand. He hadn't even mentioned the dragon. It seemed they made that up themselves. He'd simply decided not to disturb their flights of fancy. The dragon laughed, saying they were simply afraid of its power. Eren imagined the Duke from his past life and thought that this power was comparable to that of a dragon. Kainos was surprised by this reaction. Eren's daily glance indicated that he could tell the others about the orcs. In about an hour, he would call another meeting. The man nodded, putting his hand on his hip. Eren thought that Duke Eren with such power could protect his lands and subjects, and even if he couldn't, he owed it to himself to at least try. Was his promise to the former king really that important? Snapping his fingers until he shuddered. Eren thought he still had no intention of keeping those promises. His primary duty was to protect his subjects just as nobles did. He imagined the man in the crown, thinking he would definitely prepare for the battle that would decide everything. Eren sat at the table at the duchy's post-war meeting, explaining that they had successfully completed the military campaign against the orcs without a single loss. All thanks to the strategist Kainos. Cheryl took offense, pursing her lips. The man bowed, saying he was pleased to hear praise. Without him, none of this would have happened. Slamming her palms on the table, the girl screamed, asking why no one had praised her. Had they all forgotten how bravely she had blown up the orcs with all that magic? Turning to her, the boy asked who had asked her to blow everyone up. She had killed so many orcs whom they would have enslaved and worked to death. Cheryl stuck her tongue out at her brother. He stared sternly ahead, explaining that the land available to them had now increased fivefold, and he believed it was time to discuss the efficient use of this land. He proposed developing dungeons. His subordinates stared at him in surprise, asking what kind of development this was. The duchy administrator, a spy from the poor aristocracy, Max, gasped in surprise, asking if he really intended to use the dungeon to imprison tourists. Aaron turned to the man with a fan and asked, "He's already made a plan, right?" He smiled, saying he'd been a bit busy, but had still managed to do it. He placed a large scroll on the table, opened it with a wave of his hand, and declared it to be the master plan for the dungeon opening and development project. The plan took up the entire large table. His subordinates looked at it with varying emotions. Aaron clapped his hands, saying he'd done a good job. He placed his hand on Kindness's shoulder and remarked that the plan was missing two important details. The dragon's mouth dropped open in surprise, asking what he missed. Pointing a finger, Aaron declared that they would treacherously frame adventurers, forcing them on the brink of death to sign a contract that would make them his slave.